first time I heard the name Werner Herzog is when I was in college and I went to see a movie called Even Dwarfs Started Small. This turned out to be a black and white movie with a cast completely made up of little people. And the characters in the film were cooped up in some kind of institution where they've been confined. And they get out and they go completely batshit. And they just run wild. The film is complete anarchy, nihilism. It presents a vision of the human race, of the darkest possible image that we're just animalistic. If you unleash us, this is the way we'll behave. I found it very difficult to watch this film because while I was sympathetic to this idea, the dark side of human nature, I didn't like the idea that he had chosen to make these little people the symbols of that, particularly done by a German director, to set somebody who was different from us and then make them the villains, basically. Also to risk their lives, because the things that they were doing in this film seemed incredibly dangerous. And I didn't really know what their involvement with this in deciding how dangerous these stunts they were willing to do. And there was also a lot of animal cruelty in the movie that I didn't like. His character's crucified, a monkey. There's some very disturbing stuff. But I did think that there was tremendous talent there. What I didn't know is whether it was a provocation because it was something that was important that he wanted to say about human nature, or was simply a provocation to get attention for him as a filmmaker who was trying to get, known. But I was interested in seeing something else by him. He was clearly talented. And later on, after I'd moved to New York, I saw a film called Every Man for Himself and God Against All, which was released in the US as The Enigma of Kaspar Hauser. And this was a movie about a real case of a man in the 1820s who was locked in a cellar for 17 years. And then he emerges in a town square and he's found, and people try to socialize him. And it's impossible. Whatever has happened to him over those 17 years, he's never going to be a normal person. And in a sense, he really doesn't want to.
Aber Kaspar, warum läufst du denn aus der Kirche fort?
Ja, der Gesang der Gemeinde kommt mir vor wie ein widerliches Schreien. Und wenn die Leute aufhören, dann fängt vorne der Pfarrer zu schreien an.
Herzog cast a man named Bruno Schleistein as Kaspar Hauser. And this was a guy he had found in a documentary, and something slightly off about Bruno S. Some kind of mental issue or behavioral issue, I don't really know what. But when you're looking at him, you're looking at somebody that is off like Kaspar Hauser. And so he's not doing exactly what somebody like a trained actor like Daniel Day-Lewis would do. He's being himself. And that gave the film a certain kind of poetry. And I didn't feel as bothered by Bruno S. being in the film as I had with the little people, because he was being presented in a way as the artist. It was clear that Werner Herzog identified with this character, the person who's slightly at one remove from normal society and can't fit in. And he didn't want him to fit in. He thought there was something beautiful about this person being different. So at this point, I felt he's not just a promising director. Werner Herzog is truly a great director. When I was in New York, I got my first job at a company called New Yorker Films. And I was working for a man named Dan Talbot. And we worked with a lot of filmmakers, and we would pick up many, many films by each one. So we had a lot of films by Werner Fassbinder, we had films by Bertolucci, we had films by Nagisa Oshima, we had films by Godard. So one day Dan comes to me and says, we're going to be going into business with Werner Herzog. We're going to be bringing out a lot of his movies. And I said, well, that's very exciting. I think he's incredibly talented. So as he was going to be coming to the office, I wanted to do some research. So in those days, you didn't have the internet. You didn't have Wikipedia. You couldn't do a Google search. What I did instead is I went to the Museum of Modern Art. In the upper floor, they had a research department. It was run by a woman named Mary Corliss. And Mary would get me a basket of whoever I was looking for. And this basket would come, my little Werner Herzog basket, and I'd read through all these clippings, and I'd make copies of them and bring them back to the office. And this stuff I could distribute to anybody who was interested in Herzog, from journalists to the theaters that booked our films. So I started reading this stuff, and it was very strange, to say the least. Herzog had had some of the oddest experiences of anybody I'd ever heard of. So many strange things had happened to him, and he had done so many strange things. For example, on Even Dwarfs Started Small, apparently one of his actors got run over by the car. And the same actor caught on fire. And apparently he was okay. But Werner said, here's what I will do. If the rest of you come through this film okay, I will jump into a cactus. And I think we all can agree that if we're injured on a movie, the thing we want the most is for the director to jump into a cactus. That will be square. Well, they got through the film, he jumped into the cactus, and apparently he survived that. Because when I did meet him, he wasn't limping or anything like that. He seemed okay. And I talked to him for a while. We went over just technical details of getting prints and so on like that. And then I said, Werner, I really have to ask you something. I read in this article here that you seriously tried to start your own country in Africa. And I'm very curious, how did you do that? I mean, for example, where was this country? Where was Herzog land going to be? What part of Africa? And how do you seriously do that? Do you gather an army? What do you do? And I'm telling you, I was very naive. I was very young. I really just wanted to know. I believed him. And he just looked at me with the coldest look, said nothing, and it really was, how dare you ask me this question? And so he left, and I'm thinking, this is utter horseshit. He did not try to start his own country. It's just something he made up. I then had to confront the idea that journalists were the most gullible people on earth, that they were dumb as rocks. No offense to rocks. He would say these ridiculous things, and they would just write them down, and other people would repeat them. And because I didn't really believe that any of these things he was saying, I didn't believe him jumping into a cactus. I mean, maybe he jumped into the cactus, but I knew that he couldn't be more comfortable making crap up, so I don't believe it. And for example, he made a movie called Werner Herzog Eats His Shoe. And the idea of the film is that he told Errol Morris that if he finished a feature film, he would eat his shoe. And then Errol made his film, Gates of Heaven. So Werner then did this big stunt of eating his shoe. The only thing about this is Errol says, it never happened. He's been quoted in newspapers, magazines saying I didn't realize myself as an artist just to make Werner Herzog eat something distasteful. I could go on and on with these stories, but to just take a step back, to me being at New Yorker Films, we were getting movies and bringing them out. One film that we really loved was called The Great Ecstasy of the Woodcarver Steiner. And this was about a woodcarver who was also a ski jumper. And it's one of Werner's most awe-inspiring movies. The shots that he does of the ski jumper floating through the air as if he's going up towards the heavens. It's extraordinary. We also worked on a really, really good Herzog documentary called Land of Silence and Darkness. This was the story of a deaf and blind woman named Finny Straubinger. Now, Finny recounts in the film something that she saw before she lost her sight and her hearing. Take a guess at what that was.
Als ich noch sehen und hören könnte, Zuschauer bei einem Skispringen.
I realized he was just jamming that footage into this thing and it wasn't true. But the more I thought about it, it didn't bother me because I realized he wasn't a filmmaker who made documentaries and made narrative films. All his films had elements of both, and that, in fact, was his defining quality. So if you go and watch The Enigma of Kaspar Hauser, Kaspar Hauser will talk about a dream, and then the dream will just be some documentary footage that Werner did or had lying around from some other movie he did. And he would take that stuff and put it in. So there was these elements, and faking anything in his documentaries or faking anything, putting documentary stuff into his fiction, it was all fine. This was art, and you couldn't be that fussy about what was true or not.
Du hast geträumt? Was denn? Erzähl doch.
Ja, es hat mich geträumt.
Ich freue mich, dass du Fortschritte gemacht hast. Früher hast du immer geglaubt, alles sei Wirklichkeit.
At one point, Dan comes to me and he says, I've got really great news. We're going to be bringing out a Werner Herzog film called Aguirre, The Wrath of God. And it's in English. I said, really? And he says, yes, because we only were doing subtitle movies, and that immediately keeps you, it puts you in a small spot where you're not going to make as much money as the films that are in English. So I said, well, let's take a look at it. And the film, as I'm sure you've seen it, it's a great, great film, but the dubbing was stupid. It was done very quickly. I think he did it in a day or two, and it sounded like a spaghetti western, and it killed the poetry for me. And I said, Dan, is there a subtitle version? He said, oh, it's going to be better if we can release in English. I said, is there a subtitle version? There's got to be a subtitle version. Can you get it, and can we watch it? So he got the subtitle version, and then once we saw that, everybody agreed that it was so much better subtitled. The film just had so much more power that way than it did dubbed. I also worked on that film on the poster. I had a colleague named Arnie Sawyer, and we worked together, and we had an image in our mind of the opening of the film, which is amazing. There was no photograph of that. So we just printed out some images from the film, and Arnie made a composition, and we hired an artist named Michael Deese, who was just out of school, and he drew this poster, and Michael was very, very good at likenesses. He would become the in-demand artist for the U.S. Postal Service, doing all these memorable portraits of movie stars for them. Among the films I worked on while I was at New Yorker Films was Stroszek and Wojciech, and How Much Wood Would a Woodchuck Chuck, and La Soufrière. I left New Yorker Films, so I was out of the Werner Herzog business. And I started my own company working out of my apartment on the Upper West Side. It was there that I worked on films like Stranger Than Paradise and Desperately Seeking Susan. And I heard that Herzog's Fitzcarraldo was going to be released by Roger Corman's company, New World Pictures. I called my friend Steve Fagan, who worked for Corman, and I said, can you put in a good word for me? I mean, I've done a lot of work with Herzog. I know his work, so I think I would be the best publicist in town to handle this movie. And somehow Steve was able to make it happen, and I got the movie. At the same time, I got a call from Les Blank, who made the movie Burden of Dreams, on the making of Fitzcarraldo. I knew Les well because we had handled many of his films at New Yorker Films. And so Les said, Reed, I'm bringing out Burden of Dreams at the same time as Fitzcarraldo, and I want you to handle it. And I said, I don't know if that really makes sense. It's kind of two different things, and they're kind of in competition with it. And he said, you know who's interested in Werner Herzog. You know who's interested in this movie, and I trust you to do what's best for both films. And Corman authorized me to take on the other thing, and it really did work well. Because the central part of the marketing of the film really was, as always, Herzog's myth-making, the stories he tells about himself. And this was an ability, through watching this documentary, you could see the myth-making in action. You could actually see him performing these stories about himself.
The trees here are in misery and the birds are in misery. I don't think they sing, they just screech in pain.
Anyway, the idea of the movie was that there had to be a real boat dragged up a mountain. It couldn't be a fake boat. It couldn't be made out of balsa wood and light or something like that. It had to be a thousands of pounds boat that was dragged up, risking the lives of the people who were pulling it over the mountain. Otherwise, it was going to not be true. And it seemed to me, that makes sense. If you're dragging something that's really light, you're not going to be exerting yourself in the same way. It's not going to read as authentic. And so I went after selling this idea of dragging this boat up the mountain like a religion. I believed it, and I was so passionate about telling this story. After the movie came out, I saw this little article in Variety, and it said that Herzog had shot some of the film with a little toy boat at Bavaria Atelier Studios. And I was saying, oh, this is obviously baloney. That couldn't happen. So I called Herzog in Germany, and he wasn't there, but his wife answered, and she said, oh, Reed, yeah. I mean, he was doing some shots of the boat on the stream, and it just didn't work. So he got a model built, and they shot it in the studio. And when she said that, it was like somebody took a concrete block and threw it at my stomach. I was destroyed by this. I believed in it. I believed in this idea, and I'd been selling it night and day. And the idea was, if something didn't work with a real boat, well, you just had to make it work with a real boat. You didn't fake it. The whole thing was a lie in my mind. And I was heartbroken. And I felt really, really deceived in a profound way. And it was a kind of moment where you grow up, when you find out that your God is sort of a false God, even despite all the things I had said about him before, this was kind of the last straw for me. I think I might have seen maybe one or two of his films after that. I basically tuned out. If I ran into him at a film festival, I didn't say hello, and he didn't seem to notice me anyway. So we just passed by each other, didn't say anything, and nobody ever called me to do publicity on a Herzog film, and if I heard about one, I certainly didn't chase after it like I might have. And I just moved on. A few years ago, I was approached to write the press book on a movie called Reconquest of the Useless. And this was a movie where 3 college kids went on a trip down the Amazon to retrace the steps of Fitzcarraldo. It was made by a guy named Sam Pressman. Sam was a true believer. He idolized Werner. I really liked him, and I said, sure, I'll work on this. But the reality was, they had shot 500 hours. There was really no spine to it. There was no story to it. But I was going to do what I could with the interviews I'd done with these people and write something up, no problem. But one day I was talking to Sam, and I said, look, why don't you make this film the way Werner Herzog would have made it? Which is to say, make everything up. Just take every single piece of footage and just see it as raw material. You can put narration on stuff and say things that didn't happen, and you can have something that happened later on, put it on the first day. Use this like a deck of cards, just shuffle it all up, make it into an interesting narrative documentary fiction, something like that. He asked me to come by his apartment with the editor and spend a day there just talking about it. I had had some conversations with Sam about what went down, and I know that when he got to the end of the rainbow on this picture, that he learned some things about Werner Herzog that he would rather not have learned. Just some pretty bad things. And I kind of identified with it with my own story. So I thought, why not have this be a movie about this journey that he and his friends go on, and there's setbacks and it goes twists and turns. But finally, when he gets to this place, he finds out that this person that he dreamed of, that he idolized, that this idol has feet of clay. It's not what he thought. And he has to face that truth, and it makes him grow up. Of course, it didn't have that impact on Sam. Sam remained the same huge fan of Herzog at the end. None of the information he got changed him in the slightest. He just totally was a true believer. But we had this meeting. I gave him a lot of suggestions, and then I went away, and he and his editor made a new version of the film, which I think is much, much better. But it wasn't my suggestions. He made his own movie, but kind of using this idea that anything was possible. Sam's retracing of the Fitzcarraldo experience forced me to retrace my own. What he told me about Werner was so much worse than a toy boat. Why did I feel so traumatized and betrayed by my discovery? Because it didn't just end my desire to know Werner, it caused me to stop trusting practically everything people told me. But at the same time, it didn't shake my belief that Herzog was a great filmmaker. And there's no disputing that the whirlwind of truth and lies that make up Werner Herzog allow him to find a more profound truth than most people ever reach for.